Athens, 404 BCE. The mighty walls that once defended the city are being torn down amid the triumphant music of Spartan flutes. Merely a generation earlier, Athens was at the height of its golden age, a vibrant center of democracy, philosophy, drama, naval power. They had it all. But now it lay exhausted and defeated at the end of a long and bitter conflict with its rival, Sparta. This conflict, the Peloponnesian War, raged from 431 to 404 BCE and engulfed the Greek world in an unprecedented struggle. But it was more than a simple contest of arms. It was a war of ideals, strategies, and wills that pitted democratic Athens and its naval empire against the oligarchic Sparta and its Peloponnesian alliance. City-states across Greece, and even beyond, were drawn into the conflict, making this a truly pan-Hellenic war. Thucydides, the exiled Athenian general turned historian, called it a war like no other. And indeed, it did mark a dramatic turning point in Greek history. For nearly 3 decades, siege and plague, pitched battles and naval clashes, betrayals and revolutions, it became the harsh reality of life for countless Greeks. And so, the war's story has come down to us through the works of contemporary sources such as Thucydides and Xenophon, through the biting comedies of Aristophanes, performed as the war still raged, and through later reflections by writers like Plutarch. These accounts reveal not only the military and political aspects of the conflict, but also this cultural and philosophical set of repercussions. We'll be relying on these primary sources, all the ones I just mentioned, and I think you'll see that they provide quite the insight. We're quite lucky to still have them. So by the war's end, Athens was certainly humbled. Sparta was supreme but strained, and the entire Greek world had been transformed. How did it all come to this? Well, the war itself was a contest of power and principle. It raised timeless questions, questions that we will answer today. Justice, ambition, the nature of human fallibility. We'll get to them all. It all began amid confidence and patriotic fervor, and it ended sifting through the ruins. Legacies, dead. So let's go back to the ancient world. It's Sparta versus Athens, Greek versus Greek. The great bloody war of antiquity, about to begin. But not after I welcome you to the channel. Well, not before, rather, I welcome you to the channel. We're off to a good start, aren't we? Well, for anyone new, I'd like to give you a warm welcome and invite you to subscribe. Those who have already subscribed, you have my thanks. Why don't you leave a like and a comment too? Always good for the algorithm. You will get 0 ads in this video, and it's all thanks to those lovely people supporting the channel on Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those who occasionally donate. I do appreciate your support. Now with all that out of the way and being said, let's get to the topic at hand. Nice and relaxed. We'll take it nice and slow, and of course, right from the beginning. The roots of this war lie in the decades after the Persian Wars, when Athens rose to become the head of the Decelean League, a coalition of city-states, basically, originally formed to deter Persia. But over time, Athens transformed this alliance into its own little empire. It moved the League's treasury to Athens, compelled members to pay tribute, and even stationed garrisons to enforce its will. Will, of course, always being enforced at the end of a spear. Pretty effective. Athens grew wealthy and powerful. They expanded their navy, and also their cultural influence. And then there was Sparta, the preeminent land power in Greece, and the leader of the rival Peloponnesian League. They viewed Athens' growing empire with alarm. According to Thucydides, the fundamental cause of the war was, quote, the rise of Athenian power and the fear it inspired in Sparta. This fear, partnered with rivalry, set the stage for the conflict we discussed today. Immediate provocations soon triggered an open war. Athens had antagonized Sparta's allies through a series of actions. It formed an alliance with Corfu, also known as Corcyra, against Corinth, intervening in a dispute that saw Athenian ships skirmish with Corinthian ships. It then besieged Potidæa, a Corinthian colony that rebelled against Athenian control, and it imposed harsh economic sanctions on Megara, that being the Megarian decree. This basically banned Megarian merchants from Athenian markets, and that's a big deal. Economic sanctions, effectively. That can ruin a country just as much as war can. Ancient, medieval, modern times. The rule is the same. Of course, these moves, they weren't well received in Corinth and Megara, and they were viewed by the Peloponnesian League as aggressive violations of that 30 years peace treaty that had kept hostilities at bay, at least barely at bay, since 445 BCE. Sparta, it was urged by its allies to respond. Everyone was relying on the big, tough guy of the group to throw the first punch. And Spartans were not known to back down from a fight. You don't need to be a Rhodes Scholar to know that. In 432, after tense deliberations, the Spartan assembly voted that the Athenians had indeed broken that peace, and that the only thing they could do was go to war. Thus, in the spring of 431, the Peloponnesian War was well and truly on. The first skirmish occurred even before the formal declarations. In a quite daring move, Thebes, that is a Spartan ally, attempted to seize the Athenian allied town of Plataea in a surprise night attack. But it did not go as planned. The raid failed. Plataea's citizens fought back and captured the Theban infiltrators. But this incident certainly lit the fuse. Full-scale war commenced. The Spartan king, Archidamus II, led a grand Peloponnesian army into Athenian territory, inaugurating the cycle of yearly invasions that would characterize the first phase of the war. At the onset, Athens and Sparta adopted pretty different strategies. Of course, they both had their strengths and weaknesses. Athens, under the guidance of its leading statesman Pericles, decided quite prudently to avoid pitched battles on land against Sparta's fearsome hoplite army. No one wants to go up against that. They had quite a reputation. This is after Thermopylae, by the way, that was back in the Persian Wars. Well, instead, Pericles urged all residents of Attica to shelter behind Athens' formidable long walls, named, of course, for their length, very creative, which connected the city to its port of Piraeus. Protected by these walls and supplied by sea, Athens could hold out pretty much indefinitely. It was a good strategy, at least in a defensive sense. Meanwhile, the powerful Athenian navy would conduct raids along the coast of the Peloponnesian League, harassing enemy territory and maintaining vital supply lines. Sparta, for its part, relied on its supremacy in heavy infantry. Every summer, Spartan forces invaded Attica to burn crops and threaten Athens, hoping to draw the Athenians out into open battle. Attica, by the way, that is the region in which Athens was situated. But of course, Athens refused to oblige. This frustrated the Spartans quite a bit. They wanted that pitched open battle. But the Athenians, well, their navy ranged at will. The Spartans didn't have much of a navy, so their advantage was kind of checked by that. We get to that first winter of the war, where Pericles delivered a famous funeral oration for the fallen Athenians, extolling the virtues of the city's democracy and the value of sacrifice for freedom. His words managed to lift Athenian spirits and justify their resolve, but this idealism would soon be tested by more grim events. In the second year of the war, that being 430, there was an unexpected disaster. It struck Athens from within. A devastating plague broke out in the overcrowded city. The disease swept through the population trapped behind the walls. Tens of thousands died. Thucydides gives a gripping account of the plague's horrors. People dying rapidly, social order collapsing, and even the usual customs of burial abandoned in panic and despair. The epidemic wiped out perhaps a third of the Athenian population, and it also claimed Pericles himself in 429, robbing Athens of its most capable leader. Now that's salt in the wound, for sure. The morale and discipline of the Athenians suffered, yet they kept on fighting. The Spartans, for their part, were so fearful of disease that they aborted their yearly invasion when they learned of the plague in Athens. After all, the plague had probably killed more Athenians than the Spartans could, especially since the plague was in the walls and the Spartans were stuck outside. Sometimes the best thing to do is do nothing. Well, after poor old Pericles died, the leadership in Athens became a lot more divisive. Charismatic orators like Cleon, a leather tanner turned politician, urged a more aggressive and punishing war strategy, whereas more cautious figures like Nicias favored negotiations and stability. The war expanded in scope and brutality. In 427, the Spartans and the Thebans captured Plataea after a prolonged and grim siege, and in their reprisal executed the Plataean men, sold their women and children into slavery. That same year, civil strife erupted in Corcyra, Corfu, that is, where a battle between pro-Athenian and pro-Spartan factions devolved into a bloody massacre. As Thucydides describes, revolution in Corcyra led to gruesome atrocities and a complete breakdown of social norms, a terrifying sign of how this war was tearing apart the fabric of Greek society. And we say Greek society because, after all, Athens was Athens, sure, Sparta was Sparta, but Greece was also Greece. Back in those days of the Persian War, they put all those differences aside, and all the Greeks stood together against that existential threat. Well, living memory notwithstanding, it was all over now. Back to fighting each other. Athens itself showed a ruthless resolve to maintain its empire. When the city of Mytilene on Lesbos revolted against Athenian rule in 427, the Athenian assembly initially voted to put the entire male population to death, though they reconsidered the next day and reversed the decision, executing only the leaders of the revolt. Perhaps they needed the tax revenue. Who knows? But dead men don't pay taxes, that's for sure. Of course, this entire episode shows how the pressure of the war was just eroding those traditional restraints, and everybody was on edge, passions inflamed. Despite all the setbacks and horrors, Athens also enjoyed key success in the mid-420s. In 425, for example, an Athenian naval and land operation on the coast of Sparta's territory resulted in quite a nice little victory for them. A rather clever Athenian general you might have heard of, Demosthenes, don't be confused though with the latter orator of the same name, fortified a position at Pylos in the Peloponnese. When Spartan forces attacked, Demosthenes, aided by the brash politician we've mentioned, Cleon, who arrived with reinforcements, managed not only to repel them, but to trap a group of Spartan hoplites on the small island of Sphacteria, just offshore. After weeks of siege, the starving Spartans on Sphacteria did the unthinkable. They surrendered. Spartans surrendering. Now that is something to write home about. In a shocking turn, about 120 Spartan hoplites, members of Sparta's elite military class, laid down their arms, put their hands above their head, and allowed themselves to become taken captive. Now that was a severe blow to Spartan prestige, and, well, you better believe that word spread about it pretty quickly. The Spartans were legendary for fighting to the death, and their surrender, well, it was unprecedented. The Athenians brought the captive Spartans back to Athens as hostages, and Sparta, desperate to recover its men, offered peace. But the Athenians, elated by their success, just refused outright. They could have ended it right there, but they didn't. Well, the war continues on. With these hostages as leverage, Athens had, by the way, threatened to execute them if Sparta invaded Attica again, and they'd do it. The annual ravaging of the Athenian lands was effectively put on hold for a few years. Yet the fortunes of war, they always seesaw back and forth, and they continue to do so. In 424, Sparta found an opportunity, just on a different front. A bold Spartan officer, Brasidas, marched north through Greece to challenge the Athenians in Thrace, where many of Athens' tribute-paying allies and valuable resources like timber and silver mines were located. And Brasidas really proved to be a charismatic commander. He persuaded several Athenian subject cities to defect by appealing to their desire for liberation from Athenian hegemony. His greatest prize was the capture of Amphipolis, a strategic Athenian colony on the Strymon River, which he took by surprise in late 424. The loss of Amphipolis, which controlled key resources and trade routes, was a heavy blow to the Athenians. Thucydides himself was the Athenian general sent too late to save them, an outcome that led to his exile and gave him the freedom to begin writing his history, actually, so silver linings, I suppose. In 422, Athens sent Cleon to lead an army to recapture Amphipolis. Brasidas met him in a battle outside the city, and in the ensuing Battle of Amphipolis, the Spartans and their local allies were victorious. But both Brasidas and Cleon were killed in the fight. With Athens' most hawkish politician gone, and Sparta's most audacious general also removed, both sides found themselves tired and ultimately leaderless. And this is where things took a little bit of a different turn. Diplomatic voices gained the upper hand. In 421, Athens and Sparta agreed to a ceasefire, drafting what became known as the Peace of Nicias, named Nicias, as we've mentioned, the Athenian general and statesman who helped negotiate it. It was supposed to last 50 years, and largely restored things to a pre-war status quo. Both sides agreed to return most of their conquests and exchange prisoners. Athens got back Amphipolis, at least on paper, and other holdings too with it. And the Spartans, well, they captured at Sphacteria. They were finally returned home. Rather, the Spartans captured at Sphacteria, excuse me. The Peace of Nicias brought a much-needed respite from these open hostilities, an intermission in which exhausted combatants could breathe, albeit while looking over their shoulders, one can imagine. It was a troubled peace, right from the start. Key allies of Sparta, such as Corinth, Thebes, Megara, they resented the treaty, and they refused to join it. That did quite a good job at undermining its credibility. Sparta and Athens soon found that not all terms of peace could be enforced. Amphipolis, for example, refused to revert to Athenian control. And the result was a half-peace. Overt battle ceased for a few years, but distrust lingered, and sporadic clashes and intrigues continued. It was meant to last 50 years, but it would only last 6 before the war reignited in an even more expansive theater. So during that uneasy lull after the Peace of Nicias, Athens' aggressive faction remained well and truly active. The brilliant and restless Athenian politician Alcibiades came to the fore, and he undermined the peace by forging new alignments. Notably, he enlisted Athens in a coalition with Argos, Elis, and others to challenge Spartan influence, and this led to the Battle of Mantinea in 418, when the Spartan army won a decisive victory, reaffirming Spartan dominance on land, and frankly embarrassing Athens and its allies. In 416, Athens shook the Greek world with an act of ruthless imperialism. It besieged and obliterated Melos, a small, neutral island that had refused to submit to Athenian demands. They just didn't want to enter the war at all. Leave us alone, they said. Well, if you won't come to Athens, Athens will come to you, I suppose. The Athenians killed all Melian men of military age, and as for the women and children, they enslaved them. It was an absolute atrocity, even in ancient reckoning, but it was justified by Athens in cold terms that might makes right, demonstrating the dark turn that the Athenian policymakers had certainly taken. By 415, the truce was effectively over, and Athens, brimming with confidence and ambition, set its sights on a far grander enterprise, the conquest of Sicily. It was in that year that Athens launched the massive Sicilian Expedition, one of the most ambitious military undertakings in its history. The target was Syracuse, a rich and powerful city-state in Sicily, and a Dorian kin city of Sparta, by the way. Officially, Athens was responding to a plea from the city of Segesta, an ally in western Sicily which was embroiled in a local war. But unofficially, many in Athens, led by Alcibiades, saw an opportunity to greatly expand their empire, and therefore their wealth. In a heated assembly debate, Nicias, now a senior general and a voice of caution, urged that attacking far-off Sicily was a dangerous overreach. He warned that Syracuse was no easy target, and that Athens might be inviting its own doom. But Alcibiades, in contrast, urged bold action and painted visions of Sicily's riches and the glory of conquering new lands. The Athenian people, caught up in expansionist zeal, decided not only to proceed, but to send an overwhelmingly large force, just in case. Athens dispatched a grand armada, well over 100 triremes and 5,000 hoplite infantry, along with tens of thousands of other troops and support personnel, a host representing the city's might. They were going all in this time. 3 generals were given joint command: Alcibiades, Nicias, and Lamachus. He was an older veteran. But it was evident that these leaders had divergent perspectives. Alcibiades was daring, Nicias was hesitant, Lamachus was practical. But they set sail together in the summer of 415 BC, all with high hopes. However, there were ominous signs that accompanied the expedition. On the eve of departure, a scandalous act of impiety shook Athens. In a single night, dozens of sacred Hermae, that is, stone statues of the god Hermes, were mysteriously mutilated. This kind of sacrilege caused public outrage and panic, seen as a bad omen for the journey. Suspicion fell on those revelrous and uncontrollable young aristocrats, and Alcibiades himself was accused by making enemies of involvement. He was already under a cloud for allegedly mocking the religious mysteries. Well, he vehemently denied wrongdoing, of course, and he insisted on standing trial immediately to clear his name. But his political opponents decided to defer the trial. Thus, the mighty fleet sailed, with this dark cloud hanging over its most dynamic commander. Not long after arriving in Sicily and beginning the initial operations, Athens abruptly recalled Alcibiades to stand trial for religious crimes. Rather than return to what he believed would be a rigid prosecution, he decided to defect, to run away. And can you guess where he went? Of course, he fled first to Sparta, now branded a traitor to his city. And when he got to Sparta, he advised the Spartans on how to counter the Athenian expedition, counsel that would prove to be very valuable. Later, due to personal scandals in Sparta, Alcibiades would flee again, this time to Persia, weaving a complex path through the war. Well, I will make a full video on Alcibiades soon. Quite an interesting life. Interesting is one word for it. I'll get there eventually. But let's get back to the Peloponnesian War first. The Athenians were left without their boldest strategist, and the expeditionary force in Sicily proceeded under Nicias and Lamachus. In 414, they moved to besiege Syracuse. It was here that they gained an early advantage, winning a battle on the Epipolae plateau outside of Syracuse and beginning to construct a wall to blockade the city by land. It seemed, at least for a moment, that Syracuse might fall. But remember that helpful advice from Alcibiades? Well, under his prodding, Sparta intervened directly to aid the Syracusans. The Spartans sent one of their ablest commanders, Gylippus, to Sicily. Arriving dramatically, just in time, Gylippus stiffened Syracuse's resistance, rallied allied reinforcements, and helped the Syracusans build counter-walls to thwart the Athenian siege works. The fight around Syracuse turned into a kind of trench warfare, fortifications and small skirmishes breaking out, neither side delivering a decisive blow. Lamachus was killed in action during one sortie, leaving the indecisive Nicias as the sole commander. The days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and the Athenians found themselves unable to either breach the Syracusan defences or easily withdraw from the siege. By the summer of 413, Athens, realizing the quagmire it was in, sent a second expedition to reinforce the first. This relief force, nearly as large as the initial one, was led by Demosthenes, the general of Pylos fame, and Eurymedon. Demosthenes, upon arrival, saw Athenians' favorable position and attempted a bold night assault on the Syracusan fortifications. The nighttime battle turned into, well, quite the disaster. The Athenians were repelled. They took heavy losses. Their troops panicked in the darkness, and in the aftermath, Demosthenes urged an immediate retreat to save what remained of the army. But Nicias, overly cautious and anxious about the reaction in Athens if they abandoned their mission, actually hesitated to give the order. Adding to his hesitation, a sudden lunar eclipse occurred in August of 413. Nicias, being deeply superstitious, consulted his soothsayers, who declared the army must wait a full cycle of the moon, nearly a month, by the way, before departing. Well, he shouldn't have listened to them, because this delay proved to be fatal. Seizing the opportunity, Gylippus and the Syracusans struck back decisively. In a major naval battle in Syracuse's harbor, the reinforced Syracusan fleet, using daring tactics like the defensive barriers and flaming ships, defeated the Athenian navy. Well, the Athenians, they found themselves trapped. Their ships were wrecked or blockaded. Their army could neither take Syracuse nor easily escape by sea. Nicias finally resolved to lead a retreat by land. In a miserable column, the entire Athenian expedition, tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, and camp followers, abandoned camp and marched inland, hoping to reach safety in friendly territory. What followed was a nightmare pursuit. Harried by Syracusan cavalry and local forces, cut off from water and supplies, the Athenians marched for days under constant attack and brutal sun. Many collapsed or were captured. At the Asinarius River, desperate to drink, the Athenians fell into disorder and were overwhelmed. Demosthenes' contingent had already been surrounded and forced to surrender. Now Nicias' exhausted band was also cornered. Nicias surrendered himself to Gylippus, trusting Spartan honor to at least spare the men's lives. Well, you shouldn't have trusted them. The victors showed very little mercy. Despite Gylippus' wishes to take the Athenian generals as prestige prisoners, the furious Syracusans executed Nicias and Demosthenes. The remaining Athenian survivors, several thousand ragged, wounded men, were thrown into the stone quarries of Syracuse. Hard job. There, in cavernous pits open to the elements, they languished for months, suffering hunger, thirst, and disease. A few survivors were eventually sold into slavery, or, by legend, earned pity by reciting Euripides' verses to their captors. But most of them just perished miserably. The Sicilian Expedition ended in a catastrophic loss of an almost unfathomable scale. An entire Athenian armada and 2 full armies completely obliterated. When news of the disaster reached Athens, the city was overcome with grief and then panic. Thucydides writes that the Athenians refused to believe at first that their forces were utterly gone, but slowly the grim reality set in. Athens had lost upwards of 200 ships, and perhaps almost 40,000 men in the Sicilian misadventure. It was a blow from which many believed Athens could never recover, and so the year 413 marked the nadir of the Athenian fortunes. But the war, it was not over yet, and the resilience of Athens would soon be tested like never before. The collapse of the Sicilian Expedition drastically shifted the balance of power in the war. Sparta and all of its allies seized the momentum. In 413, even before the news of Syracuse reached the Peloponnese, the Spartan king Agis II took a brave step. He established a permanent garrison at Decelean, right inside the Athenian territory. By fortifying Decelean in Attica year-round, the Spartans choked Athens from the landward side. The Athenians could no longer access their farms or the silver mines at Laurium, and nearly all livestock had to be either slaughtered or moved inside the walls. Thousands of Athenian slaves escaped to the Spartan camp. Athens now faced a constant land blockade and a strained economy. Just as it reeled from the Sicilian losses, things were going from bad to worse. But at the same time, Sparta courted the support of Persia, believe it or not. Seeing Athens weakened, the Persian satraps in Asia Minor, notably Tissaphernes, and in the west Pharnabazus in the Hellespont region, were eager to reclaim influence over the Greek cities of Ionia. In late 412, Sparta and Persia struck a deal. In exchange for Persian funding to build ships and pay crews, Sparta agreed to recognize the Persian king's claim to those Ionian Greek cities. Talk about a deal with the devil, right? Sometime before, just a few generations, they were desperately fighting against the Persians. Well, now they're fighting with them. It's funny how it works, doesn't it? There's no real loyalty. That's a tale as old as time. People will throw you under the bus for their own ambitions, whether that's on a scale of war or just personal. Well, with Persian gold flowing into their war chest, the Spartans could suddenly afford to construct a navy and lure skilled rowers away from the now poor Athenians with better pay. And this was a striking reversal of roles. The once dominant sea power Athens was now struggling to find a fleet, while land-bound Sparta assembled squadrons of triremes with all that Persian money. It did not go unnoticed, by the way, that Sparta, which had once fought Persia to keep Greek liberty intact, was now effectively selling out Greek interests to Persia to win the war. Believe me, quite a scandal at the time. Facing multiple crises, in 412 to 411, the revolt of many Athenian subject allies, an empty treasury, and the enemy's new, shiny navy, Athens still refused to admit defeat. They were holding on with everything they had, and that wasn't much. Instead, they displayed remarkable resilience and even quite clever resourcefulness. They scraped together reserves, melted down gold dedications, and even used emergency funds that Pericles had set aside for extreme situations. And the situation was as extreme as it gets. So they built new ships, somehow managed to muster new crews for them too, but the traumatic sting of defeats also shook confidence in the democracy among some of the Athenian elite. These oligarchic conspirators argued that the war had been lost through democratic recklessness, and that a smaller ruling body could negotiate better terms, especially with Persia, now that you've got the third wheel in the combat. In 411, they carried out a coup in Athens. Backed by force and intimidation, the assembly was persuaded to dissolve itself in favor of a council of 400, with power concentrated in oligarchic hands. They promised eventually to broaden it to the 5,000 wealthiest citizens, but would you have believed them? It's largely a placating gesture. It's kind of like when people make election promises. If you elect me, this will happen, that will happen. Well, if they're already in power, why don't they just do it now? Interesting, right? We see little echoes of our modern world in the ancient times. The new regime fortified itself, and it began negotiating with Sparta and Persia alike. However, the Athenian navy, the backbone of the city, and manned largely by Democrats, was then stationed on the island of Samos. When news reached the fleet that the democracy had been overthrown, the sailors and marines simply refused to accept the coup. They held assemblies of their own, declared loyalty to the old constitution, and even voted to recall Alcibiades, who had by now ingratiated himself within the Persian court. To help win Persian support back, maybe it was a good idea to have Alcibiades back on board. Essentially, two governments now claimed to represent Athens, an oligarchy in the city, and a democracy in exile based around the fleet. This untenable situation lasted a few turbulent months. The oligarchy in Athens proved both unpopular and inept. It failed to secure Persian aid or significant Spartan advantage. By late 411 BCE, internal dissension, led by a moderate oligarch, Theramenes, and the threat of the democratic navy moving against the city led to the collapse of the 400. Power was transferred back to the broader body of the 5,000, in effect a mix of oligarchic and democratic elements, and not long after, full democracy was restored with surprisingly little bloodshed. Athens had survived a dangerous bout of political infighting, thanks in part to the unity and determination of its fleet. And against all odds, Athens also went back on the offensive at sea. In a series of naval battles between 411 and 410 in the eastern Aegean, near the Hellespont, that being the vital grain passage, the Athenians demonstrated that they were down, but definitely not out. At Abydos and Cynossema in 411, the most decisive battle, the Battle of Cyzicus in 410 BC, the Athenian navy won significant victory over the Spartan fleets. At Cyzicus, Alcibiades, now acting as an Athenian commander, and his colleagues tricked and completely defeated the Spartan navy in a surprise attack during a storm. The Spartan admiral Mindarus was killed, and the Athenians reportedly captured a message for Sparta, stating simply, "The ships are lost, Mindarus are dead, the men are starving, we don't know what to do." Gee, if anything captures the panic, it's that, isn't it? Just that last sentence, we don't know what to do. Past the point of pretending, right? Well, the victory at Cyzicus allowed Athens to re-establish control over the Bosphorus, ensuring the flow of grain from the Black Sea, at least for a time. In the flush of this success, Sparta quietly offered peace, proposing essentially a return to the pre-war status quo. But once again, Athens, buoyed by hope and urged on by the radical Democrat Cleophon, rejected the offer, choosing to continue the fight in pursuit of a more favorable outcome. Athens' revival climaxed with the dramatic homecoming of Alcibiades in 407. Riding a wave of popularity after Athenian naval successes, he returned from exile to Athens, where he was actually extravagantly welcomed. The charges against him were completely dropped, and he was given a post of command again. It seemed that Athens might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But the fortunes of war were still quite fickle. In Sparta, a new star had risen to prominence. Lysander, an admiral of shrewd intellect and an iron will. In 407, Lysander took charge of the Spartan fleet and established a friendship with Prince Cyrus, the Persian king's younger son, who had been sent to oversee the war in Asia Minor. Cyrus wholeheartedly supported Lysander, providing generous funds that allowed the Spartan navy to greatly increase in size and to pay its crews more reliably, even at higher rates than the Athenians, of course. Now that ought to attract more skilled rowers to the Spartan side. Because of a Spartan law that no commander could hold the post of admiral twice, Lysander was replaced in 406 by Callicratidas, a more traditional Spartan who lacked Lysander's political savvy, though he was brave and honorable. Well, under him, the Peloponnesian fleet of 140 ships confronted the Athenian navy in the waters off the Arginusei Islands near Lesbos. It was there, in the Battle of Arginusei 406, the Athens achieved its last great victory. Using newly built ships, manned by inexperienced crews, the Athenians managed to defeat the Spartan fleet. Callicratidas himself went down with the ship. The victory saved a trapped Athenian squadron and stunned Sparta enough that once more peace feelers were extended. But the triumph turned sour for Athens almost immediately. A sudden storm and the sheer chaos of battle prevented the Athenian commanders from rescuing numerous sailors from sinking ships. When the fleet returned home, Athens was in an uproar over the swaths of lost men. In a wave of public fury, whipped up by political opportunists, the Athenians put on trial the 8 generals who had co-commanded at the battle for negligence of duty. Despite the generals' defense, they claimed that the storm made the rescue impossible. The assembly was thirsting for some kind of accountability, and they condemned 6 of them to death. They would have condemned 8, but 2 of them were absent and escaped the trial. Probably best not to show up. Among those executed was Pericles' own son. This controversial act of internal bloodletting decapitated Athens' naval leadership. The city later regretted it, of course, but the damage was all done. At the very moment when the first-rate commanders, like the ones they had just killed, were most needed. Well, not a good decision in hindsight. Certainly a sign of how much strain the democracy was under in these desperate times. In 405, Sparta reinstated Lysander to command, circumventing the rule by naming him vice-admiral in title, but stopping short of giving him full authority. Determined to finish the war, Lysander moved swiftly to target the Athenians' last lifeline, the grain supply. He sailed the Spartan fleet to the Hellespont and captured Lampsacus, a key town on the Asian side of the strait. The Athenian navy, about 170 ships now, the last ounces of Athens' strength, rushed to confront him, and stationed itself just opposite of Lampsacus, on the north shore at a place called Aegospotami. What followed was Athens' fatal misjudgment. For 5 days, the Athenians rowed out each morning to challenge Lysander's fleet across the water, but Lysander refused to engage until conditions were exactly as he wanted. The Athenians were camped on an open beach, with no city or harbor at their backs, meaning they had to bring supplies from somewhere else every day. Despite warnings from a few, legend says Alcibiades, watching from exile nearby, frantically warned the Athenians their position was dangerous. The Athenian admirals grew complacent when Lysander did nothing day after day. But on the 5th day, Lysander struck. He waited until the Athenians had returned to shore and the crews had dispersed for their meal and rest. And at that vulnerable moment, the Spartan fleet suddenly dashed across the strait and fell upon the beached Athenian ships. Caught completely by surprise, most of the Athenian triremes were captured without a fight, many of their crews still ashore. Only a handful of Athenian ships managed to escape the debacle, one being the ship of the Athenian general Conon, who fled to Cyprus. The Battle of Aegospotami, well, that was a crushing blow. In one stroke, Athens lost the bulk of its navy, the very instrument that had built and sustained its empire. As for Lysander, he rounded up hundreds, if not thousands, of Athenian captives, and according to some accounts, executed the majority of them, notably the Athenian commanders and the hoplite marines. Sparta had sought revenge for earlier Athenian atrocities against the captured Corinthians and others. Yes, it's hard to forget that one. With the Hellespontine grain route now firmly in Spartan hands, the Athenians were effectively under siege, even before a single Spartan appeared at the walls. Lysander methodically moved to complete the victory. City after city that Athens still controlled in the Aegean and around the Athenian Empire either surrendered to Lysander or expelled their Athenian garrisons. The Spartan fleet sailed to Athens' main harbor at Piraeus and blockaded it. While on the land, the Spartan king Agis tightened the noose from Decelean and was soon joined by the other Spartan king Pausanias, leading a coalition army. Now, by the way, Sparta always had a dual rule of kings as part of their constitution. Athens was surrounded, but still, the Athenians, in their typical pride and stubbornness, held out through the winter of 405 to 404, despite mass starvation and privation. But finally, with people dying of hunger and no hope of relief, Athens agreed to surrender in the spring of 404. The terms of surrender were severe, to say the least. Spartan leaders and their allies debated Athens' fate. Corinth and Thebes urged that the city should be utterly destroyed and its population enslaved, arguing that Athens, had it won, would have done the same to others. And judging by their behavior through the war, well, it's hard to argue against that, to be honest. Sparta, however, decided to spare the city itself, claiming it would be an impiety to annihilate a city that had done good service in the past against the Persians. Instead, Athens would be rendered harmless. The Athenians were forced to tear down the long walls and the fortifications of Piraeus, a symbol of their security and empire, all done under Spartan supervision. The Athenian fleet was reduced to a token force of 12 ships. All overseas possessions and Athenian colonies were relinquished. Athens became a subordinate ally in Sparta's sphere, its foreign policy now effectively controlled by Sparta. Well, if you didn't think that was bad enough already, to add insult to injury, Lysander had the demolition of the long walls carried out to festive music. As flutes played, Spartan allies jubilantly danced and celebrated what they called the liberation of Greece. It was, by any measure, a humbling and heart-breaking moment for the Athenians. The empire they had built over decades was gone, and their city would never be the same again. Sparta also imposed a new government in Athens. Gone was the famous democracy, and in its place, Sparta installed an oligarchic council of 30 hand-picked Athenian aristocrats, who were, of course, very sympathetic to Sparta. This regime, known as the 30 Tyrants, ruled Athens by force and terror for the next year, executing and exiling many democratic partisans. Sparta placed a Spartan garrison at the Acropolis to ensure compliance, and thus the Peloponnesian War concluded with a total Spartan victory. Their political interference in Athens proved to be short-lived, though. By 403, the excesses of the 30 Tyrants sparked a rebellion that led by the exiled general Thrasybulus, who succeeded in overthrowing the oligarchs and restoring Athenian democracy under terms of amnesty. But even so, the Peloponnesian War had ended Athenian dominance for good, and Sparta now stood at the pinnacle of power in the Greek world. Well, before we go, let's have a look at a few of the more non-military implications. Of course, the war left a profound imprint on Greek society, thought, and culture. What had begun as a seemingly traditional war among city-states turned into something far more destructive and soul-searching. The shocking conflict shattered long-held norms of conduct. War crimes and atrocities became shockingly common. For example, the Athenian slaughter of the Melians and the Spartans' executions of the Plataeans broke the convention that Greeks did not annihilate other Greek cities. Thucydides noted how civil conflict, as in Corcyra, eroded morality. Words themselves lost their meaning, and extremes of violence were unleashed. In his famous account of the war, he presents the dialogue in which the Athenian envoys coolly assert that, quote, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Pretty grim, don't you think? A sign of the times, perhaps. Intellectuals and philosophers were deeply affected by the war's turmoil. Socrates, who actually fought as a soldier during the conflict, later became a vocal critic of blind popular rule. The climate of post-war Athens, tense and looking for scapegoats, would contribute to his trial and execution in 399. Story for another time, I suppose. His student Plato, and others of the next generation, grappled with questions of justice and power that the war had starkly posed. Even the genre of history was transformed. Thucydides' rigorous eyewitness-based history was itself a product of the war's demand for clear understanding, and it set a new standard for historical writing. Economically, the Peloponnesian War was devastating. Athens' treasury was depleted. By the war's end, the city was bankrupt, and its empire, once a source of ridiculous revenue, was completely dismantled. Many Athenian allies saw their trade disrupted and their fields ravaged. Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies too endured poverty and dislocation in the war's wake. Warfare had evolved from seasonable, honorable engagements to relentless year-round campaigns, straining resources on an unprecedented scale. In the long run, the Peloponnesian War weakened the major Greek states and created a power vacuum in the region. Athens, though culturally vibrant in the following decades, never really regained its pre-war political or economic clout. Sparta's victory proved to be somewhat Pyrrhic. The burdens of constant campaigning and leadership of unwilling allies left Sparta overextended and, frankly, quite unpopular. The Greek world remained fractious and exhausted. This disunity and depletion of strength made the city-states vulnerable to a new power rising in the north. Only a few decades later, Macedon under King Philip II would find little coordinated resistance when he moved to subjugate the weakened Greek cities. So in a real sense, the Peloponnesian War, a struggle to determine primacy among Athens and Sparta, ended up paving the way for the loss of Greek independence to an outside monarch. But nevertheless, the intellectual and cultural legacy of this era, the probing histories, or the dramas, philosophical debates born from the war's tumult, it endures as a treasure. I think so, at least. Well, if you didn't think so either, I don't know why you're still listening. For me, it's special, okay? Well, with that, we reach the end of our talk on the Peloponnesian War. I hope you enjoyed our hour together today, tonight, whatever time you're listening. I am going to thank the patrons and supporters on YouTube. Okay, got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Wendy, Shell, Josie, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Towery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gogan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, and Carol. Thank you so much, everybody. We had fun, didn't we? Well, kind of. I had fun. So I will wish you a good night. Wishing you all the best wherever you are out there in the world. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you in the next video. Farewell for now.